Welcome to the Movement Podcast. This show is all about movement, giving you a better idea of how you can optimize the human body to be the best it can be. So, Gray, we've got a guy that's going to be our guest today that has been not even a friend, probably part of the FMS family since the beginning, and that's Darcy Norman. And, you know, I can't say enough about Darcy and just the friendship we've had over the years, the influence he's had over the years with FMS and us. Just picking his brain, and we haven't been connected in a while, but I would argue, Greg, Darcy's in that one of the most interesting men in the world category with his trajectory of his professional career. So, Greg, I'm going to kick it over to Darcy. And Darcy, if you'll just do a background intro, I think really the listeners would love to hear from where you started and currently where you are, and then some of the things you've gone through, and you've had certainly some pinnacle, the peak of certain sports.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the time. I know this feels like a full circle moment to me because we met back in the day when I joined Athletes Performance in early 2000s, which was definitely the beginning for me. By trade and training, I'm a physical therapist, athletic trainer, strength coach. And when I got the opportunity to come into Athletes Performance, now Exos, I walked through those doors and I was like, I need to be here. Whatever I'm doing right now needs to stop. And this is what I need to be doing. And so that's what happened. Moved the family to Phoenix. And, shortly thereafter, when I walked in, Mark Verstegen was like, hey, you gotta sit with this guy, Gray and Lee, and see what they're doing on the functional movement stream, because we're trying to implement some of this stuff. And between the systems of Athletes Performance and what they're doing on a training perspective and what you guys were doing on the movement screen has still today been the base of how I operate. And so, was with Exos. I've been with them in kind of two different stints, but after Exos, got into professional cycling, which was really interesting. It was the days of when T-Mobile was finished, and then it became Team High Road. And at the time, we were the most winningest team in cycling. Not that we were winning grand tours, but we were winning individual races, because the owner of the team at that time was trying to change the paradigm on doping. And, guys had to sign contracts that if they got caught doping, that they had to pay their money back. So it was, looking at alternative methods to train. I remember we were doing some cooling stuff after training one day, and one of the riders goes, I thought this cold plunge stuff was for runners. And I was like, and how are you different? So yeah, that was funny. And then after that, got the opportunity to move to Germany and work with Bayern Munich. Had 2 really good years there, came back to the States and came back to Exos and worked with Adidas doing a bunch of technology and data stuff, building a GPS system. And that's when technology was really starting to take off, kind of 2007, 8, 9, cycling was hitting it. And then with GPS and stuff, it really took off in other sports. And then so was with the German national team through the World Cup of 2014, which went really well for us. And then also in 2018, where it didn't go as well. And so, like you said, trajectory is never linear. It's always got its ups and downs. And then from there, I went to AS Roma and became head of performance there, which was an amazing, probably one of my most challenging jobs, but most rewarding at the end of the day, as those usually are. And then, moved the family back to the States. Wanted to be kind of closer to family and get the kids out of high school. And, in the process, I met a guy, Greg Berhalter, who was a player at 1860 when I was at Bayern. Our kids went to the same German daycare, so our wives actually became friends prior to us knowing each other. And now he became the head coach of the U.S. men's national team. And so joined them in 2019. And then in that same point, also joined a company called Kitman Labs, which is a data analytics company where they have their performance, their intelligence platform in, getting all this data together into one place to make good use and sense of it for, clubs, organizations, teams, et cetera. And both medical and performance, really any technical, tactical coaching, any kind of data you can kind of put in there. So, and now, we're to present day, where had a performance for the U.S. men's national team, working towards World Cup 2026 here in the U.S., where we have the vision to change soccer in America forever. Hopefully it's trending that way, and we can do some good things when the World Cup comes to the U.S.
Well, let me add this. One of the most impressive things you ever did was made Lee Burton laugh harder than I've ever heard him laugh. And I missed it because we were out having a little bit of Mexican, and I cashed in early after 2 margaritas, and you guys continued the night. And the next morning, Lee said, we were just all there and there was some music on, and Darcy broke into the Carlton and he couldn't even finish telling the story. So that's a skill set that I think you overshadowed, but I don't know how sharp those dance skills.
That story, that whole timeline of what you just went through, Darcy, is you were being very humble, because you left that most important piece out. Because to this day, it was you, me, and Sue Falsoni was there, and unbelievable.
You did the Carlton and she did the Diane from Seinfeld, and Lee was more impressed by that than
nothing else you have ever done has impressed me more than that night that we were out.
That was hilarious. I think we got kicked out because the guy at the stage said, like, hey, you got to calm down, because I think I was covering a good 3 or 4 feet, as the arms were going back and forth.
Yep. You took over the stage. There's no question about that. And I think the band had enough. It was funny the first 10 seconds, but 1 minute into it, I think they had seen enough.
And of all the nights I had to bail, that's the one I did. I missed it. So,
well, those are the times you make the connections that you for 25 years, we've been good friends ever since. So it's something to be said. But one thing, Darcy, and all those things you just mentioned, everywhere you've gone, I think the one thing that I would assume, and you just please speak to this, we have a lot of high-level professionals like you on, is the culture that you've got to create. And I think with a lot of these, even what you said about, I think when you were in AC Roma, that you said is most challenging. What is it that you have to do when you're going into a situation that you've got to pull everybody together? You got to create that right culture. What are some of the things you've got to do in order to make that work?
Yeah, wow, it's a big question. I would say, and this was always cliche in my book until I got to AS Roma, and I read a book called The Fifth Discipline that kind of was a really good kind of team culture book, and it really put the importance of it, of just having a really clear mission, vision, values. I always thought that was extremely, kind of cliche. But now I can't say how strong that needs to be, because based on that, your values end up filtering, kind of how you do your decisions every day with the group. And then, a couple other things is trust. Another good, I tend to read a lot of books. I can't come up with any of my own ideas. They all come from books I read. But there's a book called The Trusted Advisor, and they boil this formula of trust, where it's credibility or capability plus reliability plus intimacy, which usually in the sporting context is around risk and struggle, divided by self-orientation. And so for me, it was always player first mentality, right? Because you're there to serve, you're there to help the player perform at their best, which then helps the team, or the coach or the people you're supporting. Being in the fight on the risk and struggle, because that always build bonds, like that night at the bar, we were almost in a scuffle, after they saw the dance moves and wanted us out. And so, those memories build relationships. And then, I think it's the credibility of knowing what you can do, and the reliability of being consistent in your day-to-day to build that trust with people. So that's a big one. Communication, mental models, taking the time to talk through and sit through, what other people are thinking, how they're seeing the situation. Because, we could be saying the same thing, just using different words, and feeling like we're missing each other. So really, and that's living in Germany and living in Rome, where I didn't speak either German or Italian before going in. Communication is a massive piece. And, getting that communication right. Like there's a ton of miscommunication, even when we're all speaking English, because the words we use and the words we choose. So taking the time to see through and sit down and really understand what that means for people is critical to building a good culture.
No, I think that's the lesson I had to learn in leadership. I was trying to enforce accountability without establishing communication first. Once communication's established, if somebody isn't pulling their weight, that's just insubordination or disagreement, and you got to do what you got to do. But if they don't understand and you don't painstakingly go through the process to make communication your biggest problem, I think it's hard to leverage accountability. And so I remember in the early days of movement screening, of mentoring a group, of trying to be in a team, but also sort of a player coach, a leader, I made a lot of mistakes by not being crystal clear and transparent. But the funny thing was, once we all got the movement sort of raising the bar, if I didn't hit the mark, they knew it. If they didn't hit the mark,
Yeah.
I knew it, but it's a safe environment. Nobody's getting fired here because it was an honest, and we're playing the 80-20. 20% of the time, it ain't going to go this way, and we're going to have to reinvest with a little more scrutiny. 80% of the time, it should be going pretty good, or we ain't got a system.
Well, one thing you said,
Yeah.
Darcy, that's you said cliche, and I understand why you said that, but to a lot of people listening, I do give Athletes Performance a lot of kudos on that, because I think it was very clear. Everybody coming in at Athletes Performance knew what the mission was going in. And it was a culture that was set from day one when you walked in the door. And I'll go back, and one of the things I think Gray and I made the assumption, Gray talking about communication, pretty much for the longest time, it was Gray and I and whoever else we met, like you and whoever it was, we met. But once we started trying to create a business, a mission was I never even considered it. And then we got some marketing people, branding people getting involved. They're like, what's your mission? I'm like, well, isn't it clear what our mission is? And they're like, well, no, we got to write it down. And it wasn't so much for Gray or I, because Gray and I we've known since 1997, move well, move often, get people doing the right things, quality, whatever. But until we had to sit down and lay it out, not so much for us, but so everybody else in our organization and that gravitated to us knew what we were trying to do. So even though it sounds like a cliche, knowing what your mission and vision is so that you can easily communicate that out to everybody around you is critical if you want to create a good culture.
Hey guys, if you're enjoying this podcast with Darcy Norman like I am, you'll realize that in the background, this guy is blending some of the best sports science and high tech available to athletes today, as well as tried and true functional movement principles. So click on the descriptions below if you want to see the newest tech we're doing or some of the tried and true education that gets you functional in the first place.
Yeah, for me, it's like the map, right? Like here's the map of where we're going. And then the values are the method in how you get, through your map to your destination. And, to your point, like the communication piece and the values, because I've had to let people go, unfortunately. And it's not necessarily because they're bad people, because that's how they tend to take it. Like, oh, I'm bad, I did it wrong. And it's just that the values of where the organization was going that we thought needed to get there are not the values that you want to practice. It's not a personal thing. It's just, they're the values. And, we need to find people that have similar values. Like I saw in you all, right? Move well, move often, and with quality, that like, hey, I align with those values. I'm into drinking whatever Kool-Aid they're making. And that's like, to me, it's that simple. And, do you demonstrate those values day in, day out? And, are those values going to get you to whatever that mission and vision that you're trying to get after?
It occurred to me, the whole move well, move often, there's a period behind move well, because we've got to draw a line in what's good enough. And now that wellness is a very popular word, probably more popular than it's ever been, it's at the same level of scrutiny as the word function was when we tried to baseline function. Everybody wanted a functional approach. Everybody thought they were taking a functional approach. And if you weren't bodybuilding, you were, i.e. by default, a functional strength coach, right? We're not bodybuilding, we have other agendas other than physique. However, if you assume that everything you're doing is function without a baseline, you won't be able to self-correct a course until it's too late. I honestly think wellness right now is poorly defined. And when we try to define wellness by your risk factors, a lot of people don't know how to relay that, to talk about that. And number one is risk isn't sexy. Neither is injury. Nobody wants to talk about it. And we can talk about risk and just flip it and say, well, here's your next opportunity. You know, if Achilles had known about that damn heel, he'd have probably worn different armor. That's all I know. But if you don't know you got that blind spot, then there's a way we got to come at you with that. And so Move Well can't just be a t-shirt. It's got to literally be, we can measure a reasonable amount of risk in this situation. And if we measure your risk is above the threshold, then at least putting that on the chart right now, just like we looked at your function, we'd like to focus on your leg raise right now. That's really all this attempt at expanding function into self-care and movement, right? If we give you the great movement recipe and your self-care is below a functional level, then upstream you're still broken. So we're really sitting there looking at that word well, saying, what does that actually mean? And well means acceptable risk, I think, in many cases, just like function means good enough in many cases.
Yeah. It's not easy because for a lot of reasons. And I'm just thinking, even me personally, right? Like I'm trying to make every decision I can during the day to be well and live well. But then there's, decisions if I go out and have too many beers, right? Like that's not promoting wellness per se. And what's that balance? And so it's a tough target to pin down and understand, because movement is just one piece. It's a critical movement because that's how we, hunter gather and get our food and interact. And so it is a critical piece to our survival. But there's a lot to it for sure.
And it's as you said, Darcy, risk mitigation. What do we want to do to try to decrease our risk, knowing that certain decisions we make are going to increase our risk? And we got to figure out if we're willing to do it and willing to sacrifice the problems that may come after that. Because sometimes that's okay.
Exactly. Yep.
Until I had an Oura ring, I didn't know how much 3 beers was costing me.
Time to sleep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I know exactly how much 3 beers cost me now. So by the amount of sleep deprivation, that sometimes I'll accept it and sometimes I'm like, no, can't do it tonight. So
Darcy, at your level and all the different places you've been, I mean, you have access, especially now, and in a lot of other places, access to so much information. What are the things that you must have in order to make the decisions on what your athletes need, whether it's a group, team, or whether it's an individual?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's very straightforward. And using my PT background, it's all around differential diagnosis for the limiting factor. And there's kind of 3 big buckets that I'm collecting information for. One is, what's the blueprint of this person? Who are they today or tomorrow, whenever you collect the information? Then you're using that information to drive what your prescription is, right, from them as an individual and then as a group. And then you're also using it to figure out what their limiting factor to getting better is. So you have this profile, this blueprint, if they were to get injured, to understand, okay, I got some base information. How do I make them better? And then how are we going to make the group better? And for me, it's very straightforward in the sense of, do they have the requisite range of motion, right? In without gravity. And, this is Gray talking 20 years ago, right? Do they have that requisite range of motion? Can they move in basic patterns? And then do they have the requisite strength to drive power and speed? And then can they apply that power and speed in accelerating, decelerating, changing directions, and can they apply that in the skill of their sport? And so it's range of motion, kind of basic manual muscle testing, isolated stuff to just make sure there's no neurologic issues, right? Like you're just eliminating fatigable weakness and facilitated stuff in the nervous system. Then, the functional movement screen stuff, which is a key component to put this together. And then you have, strength numbers is all your stuff in the gym, your force plate, power stuff that you're doing with 1080 sprint, or, stuff you could pull from View Motion. And then it's the applied skills, which again, we use View Motion to help understand how these guys are moving out on the pitch without kind of applying the skill. And then it's, all the GPS data that we're getting and the video that we're getting from actually monitor training. And once you have all those numbers, like the stuff that we're able to predict and say, like, if we do this drill, that drill, this, I can tell you within 5% how much somebody's going to run, how many changes of direction they'll do, at what intensities. It's silly. And with the video stuff that we talked about earlier, that technology and the AI is getting better, where it's bridging the gap between the weight room and the weight room in the field. So I would say those are the big chunks.
All right, let's take a quick break here to tell you about Symmio. Symmio is our holistic wellness platform designed to give you the tools and resources to assess, manage, and improve your clients' and patients' overall health and wellness. Go to Symmio.com to sign up for a free trial today. That's SYMMIO.com.
We got 2 new courses I think you'll like. One's a deep dive on mobility and one's a deep dive on stability. We really unpack that and show you how simple single corrective exercises aren't nearly as good as a meal of mobility assembled in a flow, in a set of stations. Do the same thing for stability. It's sort of a new way of looking at things, but it's that same old functional approach, just with nice packages that actually give you huge dividends.
And now let's pick up where we left off.
Just on what you just said, one thing you made me think of, and I use it in mentorship a lot, is I've always told people that first pass of data collection, that's on you. I'm weighing and measuring you, and that's on you. When I'm mentoring those people who are influencers, who are getting ready to take a specific sniper shot of action, I think this is the weakest link. If you're a mechanic, you don't fix 2 parts at the same time. You fix a part, you run the baseline. You fix a part, you run the baseline, or you do a full rebuild. There is no in between. Make your sniper shot or back up and collect more data. But one thing that I've really tried to use in mentorship is all this data you just collected, it doesn't always come back to you on the second pass perfectly and well packaged, like I did exactly what Gray or Darcy said and I got exactly what they said it was going to be. What I've found that really buffers the information overload is you're going to have fast responders, medium responders, and slow responders. And if I had to just oversimplify it, I think the fast responders are actually inefficient because they're bringing the wrong organization and software to the situation. They have a tone issue. Too much posterior chain, not enough anterior chain equals inefficiency and maybe some risk. Whereas if you have people who've had serious tissue problems, the limiting factor here is your tissue extensibility, is your circulatory matrix, the scar tissue, the lack of range of motion we're never going to get back because that ankle used to have a screw in it, right? So there are people with legitimate tissue problems that will respond, but it's not going to be like the toe touch progression that you saw on stage at Perform Better, where the guy was at his kneecaps and we did the thing and he touches his toes. That was 100% tone. I can't change the fascial matrix or the circulation that quick. So I think once the data is collected and the baseline's there, there's a huge mentorship opportunity to say, okay, now let's gauge our influence on the situation. And if we have a poor strategy, we won't get the feedback. But if we are getting feedback, it's going to be miraculous and impressive, or it's going to be at a snail's pace. And both are okay if you know who you're working with and what the problem is. So there is a response that I think is part of the feedback loop that is part of the art that we put on the backside of the science that you just did. And that level of patience that you have to have sometimes is got to be exemplified by your mentor, or you expect everything to be perfect, or you just keep trashing your model and going for the next shiny thing, which I see quite a bit.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think it's also because when you do have those magical moments, you make that change really quick with somebody. You feel like, oh, I want that every time. Like it's a drug to me, to where like, oh, I'm not finding the right key to unlock this lock, and so I'm going to keep digging. But to your point, it's always a test retest. Like I'm doing something, I'm retesting. And if I see even a glimmer of hope and change in what I just did to improve that, then it's okay, how much did I improve it in that moment? And then in the next time I see them a day or two later or whatever, the next day, did that change stick or did we backslide? And then that's also giving you information of, how fast you think you might be able to progress them. And then, yeah, it's never a perfect formula, because there's also this re-education piece that has to take place where you may unlock something and their test is great, but now you got to do a little bit of constraints-led learning in their movement skill scenario to reintegrate that into the pattern. And I think that has a big add to this as well, because you can make that change. They can come back tomorrow. They look the same as they did the day before. But if you can get them to use it and repattern it, then it's going to, I think, stick more, and you're kind of off to the races.
One of the tricks that has taken me about 25 years to really appreciate is hitting save on the document. Meaning I'd like, and you hit the nail on the head. I used to make an impressive mobility change, but then have to go back and backfill stability, right? Now what I'm trying to do is take that movement signature I see, that pivotal dysfunctional pattern, that left-right asymmetry in single leg stance, or two completely different lunges on the same human. And what I found is corrective strategy works. Test, retest, corrective strategy works. But what we also started doing is doing corrective strategies and then having somebody get on a jump box or do about, minute and a half worth of plyos or pretty hard impact. And what we realized is we had a fragile change that didn't hold. And then I started thinking, it's going to be hard for the body and brain to hold on to dysfunction if we attack the same pattern in maybe 3 different spinal positions. Supine, quadruped, half kneeling, or half kneeling, standing, quadruped, because it's really hard to hold on to that dysfunction because so many things change. The role of the spine in quadruped completely changes going vertical. And so that was the trick. You don't just bang on the pattern at a single station like 3 sets of 10 chops and lifts to the left. You actually make them show you a good example of that pattern and then come from supine to standing at a few stations. And that's where I've really started batching corrective strategy and saying, if all you got is time to warm up, I think I can fit your corrective in there, thus nudging your state of readiness, but also incrementally reducing your future risk at the same time. It's not always possible, but the 80-20 play is, if you give me your warm-up and break from that which is your comfort zone, I honestly think I can attack both.
All right, but let me ask you, based off that what you're saying, you're going to give them a good warm-up. In essence, you're still going to have that fragile situation that then you're going to tell them to go out on the pitch, or you're going to tell them to go out onto a higher level workout. What's going to stop them from maintaining that at that point? Or how are they going to maintain at that point based off what you just said?
When I put this stuff on YouTube, the flows on YouTube, whether I was attacking mobility, stability, or a high level functional symmetry, my entry point and exit was that motor control screen, that forward reach, because you can't fake good balance. You either have a balance strategy, you don't. So if I can influence a subconscious dysfunction like grip strength or breathing or balance, I think I got the root of the weed. And I'm not sure how many times we're going to have to do this flow. We might have to do it 3 times during a practice or just once at the beginning, once at the end. But if I can just give you this nutrient, this movement kata, I think it's my best effort at giving you a tangible signal. And so I don't test flexibility, do test flexibility and test flexibility. I attack your biggest mobility issue and then see if I robbed balance to get there. Because by doing an entire movement screen, we've got your worst movement pattern. But if we only look at that, like I know some people, their movement screen's an overhead deep squat. God bless you. You must be better than me, or you must be really short-sighted, because you rob Peter to pay Paul when you go in on an isolated movement strategy. So the movement screen actually allows us to see the unfavorable side effects of banging away at hip hinge, because we could destroy single leg stance, shoulder mobility, or squatting by obsessing on one. So 1 step forward, 3 steps back is not a gain. But if you have that narrow sliver of movement that you're going to try to put this person in. So I'm really trying to use mobility and stability to friction each other to a slightly better place than make your mobility so impressively improved in one day that there's no way you could hold it. You don't know how to use it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, there's a lot of shitty drivers out there that could use lessons, right? They're still driving. They're out there moving around in traffic. And yeah, they're still going to go out and train and do these things. It's just understanding how bad is their abilities to move. And, they're already operating, right? Like they're already out there playing and running around and doing these things. Yes. Can we make them better to help this, to help their process? But they're going to train with or without you. And so how do you find that balance of then moving forward? So in a case like, there's a couple things, Gray, you said that kind of resonated with me. One little cheat that I do, to your point, is whatever that test is that's a problem. So say I see them and they're in this position. I just try and get a mental picture of that and say, what does that look like in this position? What does that look like in this position? And then upside down. And how do those kind of positions relate to what they have to do from, out on the pitch or field or whatever their athleticism entails. And I think the understanding how bad is their driving skills, and then those based on how bad their driving skills are is going to kind of curtail where we go next in the traffic that they are going to drive in. So it might be, doing these positions, and then we're just going to go out and do sled walks for 30 minutes. I'm going to hook them up to a sled and they're going to walk, and I might have them do other things while they're doing these sled walks, but they will not pull the sled if they're put together, they have stability. If they're not breathing, it's all a constraints-led scenario to reprogram them. So they get all the conditioning, they get all the posterior chain strengthening, they get all the application of what you're trying to do from an athletic perspective, all wrapped into one. So they're still training, they're still moving forward, but they're getting benefits across the board.
But Darcy, even at your level, the level of athlete you're dealing with, what I'm hearing you also say, and what Grace said in the past, and really what FMS is all about, is you're still trying to find that minimum level of competency. What is that? You just used the analogy driving skill. What's going to keep them on the road? And then once they're on the road, now let me introduce a little bit higher level of complexity. And not over complexity, just enough to see, okay, how do they respond to that level of complexity? And continue to add until, again, they're never going to be perfect. But as long as they aren't driving in a ditch and they can increase their speed, you're continuing to make progress. But also knowing, Darcy, in the world we're in, whether it's the average person or your elite athletes, as soon as they step outside of in the real world, all bets are off. Who knows what they're going to come in looking like tomorrow?
Yeah, and you're also dealing, like sticking with that analogy, what happens to a tired driver? They could be an amazing driver, but now they get a little mental fatigue, system fatigue, and then things start to fall apart, right? Like you could have the best driver in the world and they, are tired. All of a sudden, they're not as reactive as they need to be for what they're trying to do. And that is something that you have to pay attention to, or that has an umbrella. Like I always say, if your umbrella of mobility and stability is this big, you can stay in that space and not get wet, right?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as, and if you move your umbrella this big, okay, now I can move more, stay under the umbrella, still stay dry. But as soon as I'm forced to move outside that umbrella, the chances of you getting wet go up depending on how hard it's raining and so forth. So it's really that balance of understanding what their abilities are, as you said, and what the task at hand is and what the demand is.
If you have that signature, if you capture maybe that balance signature or something just as simple as an active leg raise laying on your back, meaning if I did something, whether it be in your breathing or movement pattern to influence, to take your asymmetrical leg raise to symmetry, then one of the things that I really try to do now as my own feedback loop is say, everybody's getting ready to throw out an opinion about loads, right? We go from well to often. People forget it's move well often. you don't get to trash well.
Exactly.
So it's but what I do is I've easily overloaded some people. In my early days, I would go right from a leg raise correction to maybe a half kneeling stability to a single leg deadlift with some really high profile, high speed people. What is my minimum effective dose for the hip hinge or single leg deadlift? And what it would be is after the first pretty vigorous set of whatever I did, I go back to your leg raise. If I've lost the effect of the correction, I overloaded the system, even though I haven't satisfied the exercise physiologist in my head for the day. I haven't loaded them enough that I would assume an adaptation. But if you're seeking an adaptive load that ruins the response, we're right back to where we were. So I actually will use that initial influence of a corrective to see how much I can load them without losing that in a single session. And I'm fully transparent about that. I will let them know. I'm going back to see if I fit all this work in under a better platform or if I actually sent you right back into compensation. And I've learned a lot in my own practice, both sides of the fence, being a PT at the first part of your session and being a strength coach at the back part of your session. And I've easily undone everything I did in the first part by being an ambitious strength coach and not being patient.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. It is a balance. And I think that's also a big part of what we do is with our morning screens with the players is, they see what their kind of normal patterns are like. And as a result, when they come in and they don't have that pattern, they can then go into one of the therapists, get, some mob work or tissue work or whatever the case may be, and then pattern it right back in. So it is just, they come in, check their body in the morning, and we, they go through a few things to just kind of see where they're at. And then, we're drip feeding these bits throughout the programming, whether it's an activation session. So, everyone's seeing how they're moving as well as they are and what they might need to do to make sure that when they get out on the pitch that they're driving in the best possible way, given what's in front of them.
So Darcy, are they doing that on their own? Is that something that they're just you guys teach them, hey, you guys get in here and do this. You're not standing beside them watching them do this. And then they basically have their own accountability in a way, right?
Yeah. So we have somebody on point that's, there to monitor the morning screens just to see, right? Because it's information coming in. At the end of the day, they're human. They're going to make mistakes. They're not going to do things always, the right way. So there's always somebody there to kind of just have an eye on what's happening and just engage with them. And then, we have they enter in their information. It comes up on a screen. It gets highlighted who's flagged, who's not. We can see who is kind of outside their norms, and then they come in and get that done. And a lot of times they'll know when they go to do it. They're like, "Oh, I'm not moving great today. I'm going to go, do my corrective stuff or some work on my own before they go out." And then we have within our programming team kind of activation sessions where it's going through basic patterns of, posterior chain work and hip hinging and patterns, thoracic mobility, where it's just stations that take, 15 minutes. They're doing 2 or 3 things, a couple minutes at each station, takes 15 minutes just to prep. And we're there to, see anything that they need and move it forward. So it's just kind of programmed in a lot of ways, both very structured and then totally independent. So that way we're trying to get it from all levels.
Give me a summary of those screens that they do when they walk in. Just a high level overview.
Yeah. So they do a hip rotation. So where we get hip internal rotation, they get a toe touch. So a basic toe touch. They do a groin squeeze. They'll do a weigh in, and that's more around hydration and rehydration. I think that's really
is the groin squeeze a provocation sign or a movement dysfunction sign? Are you looking for a ping of pain in that move compared to maybe some of the others where you're looking at quality way more than provocation?
Yeah,
quantity. Are you getting a measurement?
Both.
Are you getting a strength measurement?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, we're getting a strength measurement. We're asking if they have pain. And then from there, we know kind of what their norms are and how they're trending. And then we do wellness screens, like do they have any, how they sleep, any stress, any pain anywhere, soreness, things like that. And then
do they have any wearables, Darcy? Do you guys have them wear stuff like outside of the practice or facility?
Yeah, so it's obviously all voluntary, and it's not all everybody's doing the same thing. A lot of guys are using the Aura or the Whoop as a means of that, and then I think those are the big ones from that side. And then other stuff like DBT, like Output Sports, or GPS stuff. Like we use a lot of technology in other ways, but I would still say those are the big wearables, and then Apple Watch or comparable.
Well, let's get into that a little bit, Darcy, because I think that's a big thing right now, not just in sports, but just in general, this whole idea about AI and data and what we're doing with all this data. And you've been involved with so many different organizations at such a high level. I would argue you've been involved with this, collecting all this data and figuring out what to do with it for 10 to 15 years now with the organizations you've been with. And you've seen a lot. You've seen a lot of growth and a lot of development on this end. And I remember having a talk with you, really fascinating me. And you probably don't remember this. I remember thinking about this conversation today when you were working with the cycling team and just how much data that they were collecting. Give us a sense of, and you mentioned earlier in the conversation about being able to predict within a certain percent about how they're going to perform. Just give us just your overview of where we are right now. And I know that's a big kind of broad question, but I will drill down based off kind of how you respond to that, but just where things used to be when you start seeing data come in your career versus where it is now. And what do you do with it? How do you leverage that?
That's a great question. So I'm going to give you, your parents' answer of it was uphill both ways to school and 4 feet of snow when I was your age kind of conversation. So bear with me on this. Back in the day, and this back in the day was early 2000s. I know that was 25 years ago now, but it feels like not too long ago. We had a goniometer, a dynamometer, a stopwatch, sets, reps, and weight, and a tape measure. And that was your data collection, right? And then as a result, you had really good progressions. You knew that, because you didn't have all this information to give you feedback, you went with common sense of this goes to this goes to this. And you talk through the mental models of all your progressions and what made sense. And then, I always went off this book called The Checklist Manifesto. And the whole premise was, how do you reduce the amount of catastrophic injuries from something that's really complicated? Is you have checklists. And what I learned early on also through my manual therapy skills and the evaluations were, you test everything because you don't know if they have a facilitated segment or some neurological underlying tone or anything like that. So you went through, regardless if somebody came in with an ACL or a stub big toe, you went through your full neurologic exam, orthopedic exam, tip to toe. And I even would tell patients like, hey, bear with me. Some of this stuff is going to seem really irrelevant to what you're coming in here with, but it's important that we go through it just to make sure we know what we know. And now fast forward 25 years later, right, and a generation of practitioners that are coming into this space where all they know is data. They just get plethora of data. And that is where people go to, is just like, oh, what do the numbers say? Versus falling back on your progressions, your processes, and then using the data to make better informed decisions in what you're trying to accomplish. So it is interesting, like where I see people going wrong today is they're just saying, oh, the numbers are this, the numbers are that. And then you look at what they're doing from a progression and getting from somebody from A to B, and they're totally missing the boat because they're going off this number without really understanding or seeing the forest in the trees. So that's one big one. And then because of the plethora of data is, data is only as good or as accurate as the information you're collecting. And if if your data is not clean and it takes a lot of work to make sure it's clean, then you're not going to get good information out. And that's, then that gets catapulted into the AI stuff because it's giving you intel based off, shitty data. So it's complicated, but it can be done if you're diligent with it.
You gave me a flashback talking about the tools we all trained under, which was the goniometer for range of motion, the dynamometer for strength, tape measure, circumferential measurement, stuff like that. But I realized early in my career that we had an information bias toward impairment measures as opposed to functional measures. And what I realized with my own manual therapy skills and the way that I was mentored by the manual therapist that sort of knocked my edges off was Paul Hughes. And he blended his impairment collection with a few functional patterns. And I've not disguised anything. What Paul was doing in my early days of manual therapy looked more like the SFMA than most people know. We've added some patterns. We've really investigated some of our breakouts. But for the most part, he systematized a pattern appraisal alongside an impairment data collection. And so I love to take a young clinician, put somebody on the table, give them their goniometer, give them their dynamometer, give them a few of their special tests and said, can you predict if this person can touch their toes or squat or pass single leg stance? And they will easily take the bait. And they will volunteer a functional opinion without ever looking at a pattern. So I started in my early career saying, I want the impairment measures. I need to know if there's an isolated weakness or a range of motion restriction, but I'm not going to take the bait. It's so easy to collect a few functional patterns, the patterns that your body pre-organized in your growth and development, the reciprocal patterning, the squatting, the hinging, the turning, the twisting. So sometimes impairments are unimpressive and function is pretty good. And then sometimes impairments are limited and function agrees with you. That's exactly what the thing is. But by not checking both, by only doing function and not checking your impairments, you make as big a mistake as you do in both directions. And the whole point is, it's 5 minutes either way. What are you doing? Getting a latte with the other 5 minutes? Because the minute we introduced a 7-point movement screen, I had people saying, can you do it in 4? And I'm like, what the hell else are you doing with that 6 minutes that's more important than this? But they were going to argue for that 6 minutes like they were going to go create cold fusion or something in that extra time. And I'm like, no, impairment data is what our hallmark is. We need to know that at the local level. But if you fix local and still can't generate a global pattern, what have you actually done? Nothing. So.
Yeah, 100%. Like that's the progressions for me. I think that's one thing that Athletes Performance or Access did for me early with all those progressions, right, were our functional patterns. And so you took these measurements and you have a picture in your head of like, oh, they should be able to do this. They, given these kind of requisite impairments or lack thereof, this is what I would expect that they could move like. And when they didn't move like what I expected, then it was like, oh, how come? What's the, what am I missing here? And then going back and putting those together. So, yeah, 100% agree. It's you got to have both. And to your point of, people going from 7 to 4, it's this, they don't realize the importance of those other 3, right? Like those, it's kind of like that neuro exam. You can't do, you can't just test half your myotomes and dermatomes. It's got to be all or none. And you're just not appreciating what those 3 are giving you in the grand scheme of it. So, and like I get it all the time when we're doing staff education or anything like that, and people want to cut that stuff out. It's like, that's the first thing I go to and ask is, do you realize why we're doing these other 2 or 3 tests that you don't want to add in here? And what the purpose is and how that adds up to the bigger picture.
And one other thing I want to identify right away is we didn't invent function. We simply tried to insert a baseline. And I was on stage last year, and I walked out on stage and I had a group of people that obviously knew our body of work. And I said, what's the definition of function? And I freaking locked up the room. It just, I'm either getting ready to get 72 pages or a sentence. And I said, let's start with something simple. Good enough. If you have functional sleep, it's good enough. And I honestly think we've watched YouTube so long and consumed so much media that unless we optimize every system we have, we feel like we're doing Tim Ferriss a disservice. We're not hacking all the things we should hack. And I'm like, no, sometimes good enough is the operational platform across 8 domains that got that dude in the Hall of Fame or got her a gold medal.
Well, but that's
good enough at everything, superlative at one.
But that's the whole goal of AI in collecting the data. 2 things: trying to predict who's going to get hurt and trying to predict who's going to be the best player. That's what they're all seem to be searching for, in my opinion. And that's not necessarily, I would argue, what we're trying to search for. We obviously want to keep people from getting hurt, but as you said, Darcy, there's a lot more to the process than it is just to say, okay, based off all these, as Gray just said, superlatives, this is going to be the best player. Well, just because the data says so doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah, and it just means exactly you're not collecting enough data, right? Because there's still obviously stuff that we need to learn that we're missing in this process. And, when it comes to data, I kind of bucket them into 3. There's descriptive data, right? Then there's prescriptive data, and then predictive data. And we're in the descriptive, prescriptive fashion. We're still working on the predicted. And I think that it needs to be extremely clear.
Well, and I'll be honest with you, just let me insert one thing. I think the fool's goal in sports performance is literally getting too invested in predicting success, because if you could, we'd stop freaking playing. Vegas would just shut down. We got to play this out because on any given Sunday, something different might happen. However, the hallmark of my oath as a healthcare practitioner is my job is to predict failure, whether that's injury or a lack of success or an inability to adapt or respond appropriately. My job is to predict failure. And it's just like how you win a football game. Every minute of the game to the last 30 seconds, if you don't lose the game, you might have a chance of winning the game. So I actually come from the other end, and it is sexy and flashy to look at all these success markers, but I literally just go across the board looking at the failure markers. And I honestly think in my early days, getting some exposure with Mike Boyle and Mark Verstegen, I thought I had this functional screen. You couldn't do it without it. Those guys were both in 2 different Petri dishes posting better movement screens without having movement screens. You were part of that. And so you're already doing something without a movement screen that's more functional than having the baseline. The baseline only refines it further. But the funny thing is, I honestly think both camps were on a non-failure strategy, experiencing more success, and people were trying to figure out the one thing you're doing. And it's like trying to figure out the one ingredient that made that chef's meal perfect. It's not one. It's the way they put it together. It's the timing. It's the presentation. It's the whole thing. But I honestly think the fool's gold in sports science is predicting success.
Well, the problem and the why I think we're so far away, and at some point we may get there, Darcy, with, as you said, predictions still not really where we are, is just human behavior. I mean, you're going to have guys that go out and spend, all night at a strip club drinking beers and come in compared to a guy that went to bed at 9:00. And, 2 days ago, they look great.
100%.
So human behavior.
And if the strip club guy gets the gold medal, that's what everybody's going to start doing.
Yeah, that
can happen too.
I mean, Dennis Rodman proved it. You can still play at a high level, treating your body like crap. So there are people that can do that, but the human behavior factor is something we can't put our finger on. We can only figure out where they are today. And I think that's kind of the space that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, that comes down to another topic. There's a great book, if you haven't read it already, called Thinking in Bets. And basically, when someone wants to make a decision, I just ask, how much money are you willing to bet on that? Like, is it $1 million? Is it only $100? Is it $10? Because that's going to determine the level of certainty that they feel is going to happen. Because it's easy to make a blanket statement and just say, oh yeah, I can do that. Be like, oh really? Okay, how much if would you give me $1 million? If you can't do it. And then there's I'm going to butcher, I don't think remember the name of it, but she's a psychologist that won the World Cup of Poker, that wrote this, and I'm blanking on her name. But it is, what do they call it? It's basically, if you make a decision and it's right, like it could be the wrong decision, but you had the right outcome, right? To your point, Gray, they gave it a name, and that's a problem, right? Because then you just think like, oh, I keep making this decision, I'm going to have the right outcome. It's like, no, you just won on the odds. And that only happens once in a blue moon, where the right decision is typically this, resulting is what it's called, and or what she terms it in the book. And that's the problem. Yeah, you're constantly just mitigating risk to say, like we'll have these conversations in the office and the coach will want to do something. And I'm like, hey, personally, based on all these reasons, I don't think that's a great idea, and here's why. But we could go out there, everyone hammers away, and we don't have a problem, so that makes those pieces, everyone wants an answer as to the exact, like, no, tell me the right amount. Well, I can't tell you the right amount because it's, it's just not possible. I can give you based off some science, research, and so forth, but it's,
I'm glad you threw that on the table because I didn't read the book, but I heard that author be interviewed on a long form podcast. And it got me thinking that same way, because when I start talking about the physical attributes of the durable performer, right? You have a acceptable level of performance and it's sustainable. That is what we're shooting for with movement screening, self-care, rep loads. The whole thing is we're trying to create durability and performance, not either or, because one without the other doesn't mean a fast pitch that's not in the strike zone doesn't really mean much. But I started thinking in terms of articulating physical domains and physical attributes in the form of currency, physical currency, okay? Good breathing patterns, good sleeping patterns, good nutritional habits, that's physical currency. And that's the upstream stuff that looks like pennies and it's not. It's $100 bills at scale, at season, at training cycle, And so it's funny when you start looking at the way people allocate their precious resources of time and energy, and then you start looking at their friggin' workouts. I have even as a strength coach, I have no influence on an athlete's workout until they get hurt. And then I get to be in the picture. And then as I'm on-ramping them back into their thing, I know they're headed right back for the same workout that probably set them up for the Achilles heel in the first place. It didn't cause the injury, but it sure as hell didn't put their physical currency in the bank account that they were going to tap. And so I said, I want to make a few changes in your workout. All of a sudden, I become a brilliant strength coach. But it's only because I saw your last program set you up for vulnerability that you shouldn't have had. So,
yeah, exactly. It's you'd mentioned something there that caught my I think just that whole injury prevention talk, right? Like for us now, it's not we don't care about preventing injuries. It's performance, and part of performing is not being injured.
Yeah, it's being present. If you're not present, you can't do the performance thing.
Yeah, because you also have to have the capacity to work. And I think there was this, and you guys have heard it, right? Like everyone went into these like, oh, injury prevention, everyone's doing injury prevention and nobody's working anymore. And, and where the pendulum is always going to go back and forth and it sways one way. And, now it's coming back the other way with your groups like CrossFit and its capacity. And, I think I've had this kind of double standard with CrossFit where you see a bunch of train wrecks ready to happen based on what they're trying to do and how they're going. But at the same time, it's shown us some amazing things of what the human capacity can do if you put your mind to it. And then it's just, are people surviving the challenge? And so, yeah, it's you got to work. There's no question about it. And it's just how do you make that work as clean and efficient, to your point? Like, are you spending your money exactly where you need to maximize every return on investment that you're putting in?
And I've rejiggered my goal. It's now homeostasis. There is no better biological signature of potential success than homeostasis. And getting back to balance in all the domains that underpin your processing at your performance level. And so I do think that I probably would describe any degree of clinical success I have is I spend a little more time just setting up the dominoes, right? I don't have to have the teaching moment every day. Sometimes I'm just setting up the dominoes, but when it's time, we do that and a butterfly flaps its wings and we got a tsunami somewhere else. And a lot of people just don't have that level of patience because they see the trick, they see the teaching moment, they see us do one of those things. They don't ask us how long we've been setting up those dominoes or how many other decisions we chose not to make now, or lay up a little bit. That's all part of that strategy of how to play the science. And when in the early days of the movement screen, we took two different things. The limited deep squat seemed to be associated with every bad thing. So we just tried to bully the squat and do a submission of elegance. Didn't work. Then we tried the democratic approach. Let's sprinkle a minute and a half of corrective on every pattern that's bad. No, wait a second. If we look at the neurological hierarchy of movement acquisition, I'd spend your whole 15 minutes on your leg raise if I caught you on your leg raise. And that seems to level the pelvis. And if that's the problem, so I knew what we wanted to capture. I wanted all those details just like you did in your orthopedic neurological assessment. But then on the other side of that data, all things being equal, I got to prioritize one, which gets me to ask you another question. How much should people in your space and mine and Lee's space and even their personal physical development be watching their HRV? How valid of a marker is that of a feedback of your influence on somebody and their current state of readiness? How do you value that like you would a movement screen or something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. Two things you said there, right? Like, because I think the other piece that we have to pay attention to is the context of what you're talking about, right? So, like, when we won the World Cup in 2014 with Germany, somebody asked, hey, how did you guys do it? And I was talking about how organized everything was. And it was so detailed. And he said, you supply chain managed human performance. And I was like, oh, I haven't heard that term before. And I went in and it's really just setting up the supply chain in every part of the process is the most efficient it can be to maximize your return on investment. and then be able to make any adjustment in the assembly line if you find a crack in the system that you can quickly make a change to keep, your production going. And, that has always stuck with me and resonated with me because of that. So it's not only the 15 minutes, that you're going to spend that active straight leg raise, but how am I implementing that into the warm up? How am I implementing that into the training? How am I implementing that into the movement skill work? How am I implementing that into the strength work? How am I implementing that into the recovery? Like all the little bits along the chain. And so that's, I think something worth noting as it relates to that, because we can get so siloed into like, oh, I got to spend 15 minutes on an active straight leg raise and not seeing the forest through the trees. And then to your question about the HRV, like to me, the measurement of HRV, there's so many variables to it, right? Like you can use it. To me, it's like looking outside and saying, oh, it's a cloudy day. Maybe I should take an umbrella. Oh, it's a sunny day. I think I can wear t-shirt and shorts. But you sometimes walk out, especially in Tahoe, I look outside and say it's a sunny day. I walk out in t-shirt and shorts and it's 40 below, right? Like it could be a sunny day, but you walk out and the temperature isn't what you thought it was based on what you're seeing. And HRV, the measurements, the consistency in when you get it, the time of day, the measuring devices, I think it's a looking outside and seeing what the weather's like to kind of counterbalance what to be true. But it's not, for me, like you can have a shitty HRV and go out and have your best day. It's not, they're not a correlated piece.
Does that mean that this person is such a good self-regulator that they performed in a more sympathetic or less responsive state, or did they have some level to maybe adjust that on the fly in a more efficient way? Meaning, is it possible to perform well with a poorly adaptable sympathetic system because they either overcome that burden or they adjust quicker? I would, because and I don't know which it would be, because I've always, heard a lot of different science say if you've got a solid HRV capture, no placebo effect can interfere here, meaning it is what it is. And it doesn't mean it can't be adjusted, but I've always been a little bit confused about that. And I've been sort of waiting to ask you, because I know you've been leaning in.
Yeah. There is no consistent HRV thing. Like I think in education, we have to talk in absolutes to get a point across, but there's always context to it. And HRV is that same thing. There's just, when guys wake up, time of day, the various stresses, like, again, it's like looking outside and seeing what the weather's like to get an idea of how you need to prepare to be aware. But breathing, meditation, stimulation, nutrition, all those things can affect, like your body is just a chemical system, and all those things affect the chemical process. So, and everyone can affect their chemical process differently because we're all have a different genetic makeup. And so there is some consistency and some trends and things of that nature, but to say like, hey, if you do this, this is going to happen because of this, I'm not buying it. Like,
I'm glad
you got to take everything with a grain of salt.
I'm glad you said trend, because the word trend and pattern is much harder to capture than a data point. And I do find so many people with our same credentials hanging a lot of confidence on a data point instead of a cluster of data points across time and stressors that demonstrates a consistent pattern or trend of behavior. Those, coming at, and I think you got this early, our early adopters got the fact that we quit looking at movement like mechanics for a minute and looked at movement like behaviorists. We didn't forget everything we knew about the mechanics, because sometimes you need a good mechanic, but sometimes you need somebody to sequester and compartmentalize certain advantageous and disadvantaged behaviors. We got to identify a behavior pattern here. The markers will line up, but it's okay to be able to have both skill sets,
Yeah, 100%. And there is no hard recipe, to your point, because everybody's different. Every circumstance is different. The context around it is different. And, like a good example, I have a player in mind that when I saw him, I was like, wow, this guy does not move well. Like, probably one of the worst movers I've ever seen for a variety of reasons. A lot of it kind of joint structure and makeup. But he was performing at an elite level, right? And just doing really well. And fast forward now, he's had 2 Achilles ruptures. Is they a result of his poor movement patterns? I would bet a significant amount of money on the fact that it was. But is it to say that that's the case? Could it be some nutritional stuff, some stress stuff, all those things in there? 100%. So yeah, it's really hard to say. You're just mitigating risk at the end of the day and trying to do your best with that.
Lee's going to cut me off here, but I got one more question because I can't ask anybody else.
Gray has to have the last word, Darcy. Don't worry.
No. You've worked with cycling. You've worked with soccer. You are a content expert on movement screening. I have conversations all the time when people aren't on their feet in their sport, like swimmers and cyclists. How much relevance do you still put in the movement screen? I know what I think, and Lee's going to make us sum up the answer, but I don't get to ask somebody at your level who's worked off-feet athletes and on-feet athletes, does the screen have equal value, but you come at it differently? I just wanted your quick turn on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Like when you take cycling, for instance, I say it's the most active sedentary sport in the world. Because basically you got an ergonometer under your desk that you're just spinning on. And, but that's what they do for a sport. It's what they're doing the rest of the time, when they're also out and about and moving. Swimming, it's a concentric sport. You're in water. There's no resistance per se besides the drag of the water. So that piece is also important. And it's not just their sport. Like they get up and they get out of the pool and they move. So for me, to your point earlier, I think, it's always important. It's again, just how much information am I taking from all that on the decisions that I have to make in their training, their loading, and all the other bits that go with it. So again, it's just more information to help me decide how much money I want to put on this bet.
No, that's a good way to do it. And I always say I haven't seen a sport yet where a 1 or a 0 in something is an advantage. So, it may not be as much of a disadvantage in one sport as it is in the other, but it's never an advantage. So if it can be washed off, it'd be probably good to do that.
Well, Darcy, this was awesome, man. It was great catching up. Thank you so much for joining us on this, and we're got to get you on here more, especially as you guys ramp up the next couple of years. Love to see how things are going, but really appreciate you hopping on today for us.
Yeah, no, I appreciate coming back around, and it's always good. You guys, like I said, have been an instrumental piece in how I operate my day to day, and definitely appreciate you for that. And the injection of knowledge that I got to absorb in every time we get together. So the thanks are all for me.
No, we appreciate it, but I'm going to stop right now so Lee can have the last word. It'll be the first time in an episode that's happened.
There is no last word. This is it. Signing out. Thanks, Darcy. If you want to learn more about today's podcast or dive deeper into functional movement systems information, check out some of the resources and offers we're providing in the description. That will do it for this episode of the Movement Podcast.
Thanks for listening, and if you liked what you heard, please take a minute and subscribe and review.
If you want to learn more about our system and take the next step in your own movement journey,
visit us at movementpod.com.
Until next time, be sure to first move well,
then move often.